coming up was how we're looking at work. Second, what's happening to the condition of workers or labor in different market segments, and how you can understand those in context to other organization processes, that is of migration. You look at climate change as one of the major factors, and that's changing the effect of land use and land ownership, and the intricate details of looking at the very identities of group that is very rapidly churning out. So, and in fact, in a lot of discussions, I was giving this reference that we have amazing session and a series of discussions and dialogues in one day. So I'm very happy that we have this time together. Last session was fascinating and issues around the history of labor laws, concerns around it. So from what I was informed, the structure and the panel formation for this session, which is looking at the question of social identity and work itself, we'll start by having Ms. Ria going in ahead first, and then Dr. Paswala and Dr. Durand and Catherine Beck presenting in the sequence of presentations. So we have around 12 to 15 minutes. That's what is usually given in. But I'll give you a kind of a marker when you have around 2 minutes. That's all.
From 15 or from 12?
From 15.
Okay.
So if you want to have a kind of a broader discussion, I would say that maybe around 13 minutes or so, I'll just give you an idea that you're around 2 minutes. Even if you stretch by, of course, nobody makes that observation that you just reach 15 and somebody stops and so. If you're really interested in the content of the discussion, here it actually happens very often. You probably would have observed, you have 7 to 8 people in the panel, and after, so I've now consciously started saying no, that it's better not to be a part of those discussions. So I'm so happy that this was organized. So we'll have Ms. Ria presenting her work on the state of man scavenging. I look forward to it. Please.
It is a violation of human rights, violation of ILO Forced Labor Convention 1930, and lastly, it is an obstruction in achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. It leads to the obstruction of 3 major 2030 SDGs: A. Decent work and economic growth; B. Eradicating forced labor; and C. Access to justice. There is a fundamental relationship between caste and sanitation. Sanitation in India remains the sole concern of just one caste, and the practice of manual scavenging is closely interlinked with caste discrimination, structural inequality, and patriarchy. Apart from dry toilets, garbage collection, road sweeping, and cleaning of drains in Indian cities and villages are dependent entirely on an efficient functioning of the caste system. In India, people involved in manual scavenging are primarily the untouchables. People engaged in manual scavenging are highly underpaid. In rural areas, a worker gets approximately 120 to 150 rupees per month from one house for disposing of the human excreta. In urban, contractual, and they're hired as safai karmcharis, sanitation workers, and in certain places they're hired as housekeeping staff. Usually, the work of entering the sewers physically is done by men, and manual cleaning of dry toilets in rural as well as urban areas, and removal of human excreta from the public street is done by women. Human Rights Watch report claims that in this work it is 95% women who are engaged. There is not only the division of labor but also a difference in the income incurred. Most men are able to incur more money than women, though the difference is not huge. To tackle this issue, the Indian state had introduced 2 legislations. One in 1993 that led to the creation of the National Commission for the Safai Karmcharis, and the other in 2013, which deems manual scavenging as a criminal offence. It is the Prohibition of the Employment of Manual Scavengers and their Rehabilitation Act. This legislation offers a definition of what constitutes manual scavenging and proposes their rehabilitation. And the National Commission for Safai Karmchari is responsible for taking into account the cases, compensation, and punishment in cases of sewer deaths. One of the most important tasks that it has to undertake is to conduct survey for the identification of the workers engaged in scavenging and document data from all the states on the number of deaths since the year 1993. There are 2 major problems that acts as an obstacle might have been over 10,000 in the surveys conducted in all the districts. The reason for the flawed survey and incorrect number is precisely a consequence of not having a proper method and procedure listed that can be used for identifying the scavengers, the lack of the political will to address this issue, and the inadequate mechanisms. I will now move on to the budget part. I'll basically give you a brief on why budgets are important and what difference they create. So to ensure the development of scheduled castes, the government had to bring in the targeted budgetary provisions for the Dalits and the tribals. This was done by proposing a separate budget component within the union budget in year 1979. This is called the Special Component Plan for Scheduled Caste or the Scheduled Caste budget. It is this budget component from which the funds are allocated for various schemes for Dalits. But from this component itself, the money is allocated for schemes for people engaged in manual scavenging as well. So for addressing this issue, the Government of India sanctions funds to one ministry, that is Ministry of Social Justice and Empowerment. The funds are further divided into two broader schemes. One is pre-matric scholarship for children of those engaged in unclean occupation and prone to health hazards. And second scheme is self-employment scheme for rehabilitation of manual scavengers. Under the pre-matric scholarship for children of manual scavengers, the government has allocated nearly 35 lakhs in 2017. It increased to 5 crores for both the year 2018 and 19. This scholarship is given to children studying in class 1 to class 10, and the amount of scholarship amounts to rupees 110 per month for 10 months in a year. Also, the scholarship can only be available to students whose either parent is still engaged in manual scavenging. For the self-employment scheme, the workers are given one-time cash assistance of rupees 40,000 on leaving this work. However, people who avail the scheme are not permitted to withdraw more than 7,000 rupees per month. In year 2017, the government had allocated just rupees 5 crore. In 2018, it allocated 70 crore, and in 2019, there was an increase and it is 110 crores. However, if we calculate how many people can actually get benefited from this 110 crore, then it amounts to some 27,500 manual scavengers only, meaning approximately 52,000 manual scavengers don't even get a chance to avail this. So, people who are able to avail the scheme are restricted to only use 7,000 per month, which just dismisses the very purpose of the scheme, which is to support the scavengers who have left the job to start a new business or an alternative livelihood. Peak fund amounting to 110 crores that has been put on papers. However, the fund allocated is still insufficient. Also, data from RTR reveals that for financial year 15-16, rupees 36 crores for rehabilitation remain unused. For the year 17-18, rupees 24 crore remains unused, and not a single amount of money has been used post September 2017. On contrary, the Government of India has allocated the budget of approximately 18 crores and 19 crore in 2017 under the Swachh Bharat Abhiyan, which is 4 times more than what the government has allocated to eradicate the practice of manual scavenging in these areas. Alone in the state of Uttar Pradesh, 1,000 crore had been allocated under the Swachh Bharat Abhiyan in year 2017. Lack of willingness of the state to acknowledge the persistence of such labor allows this practice to continue. However, due to political pressures from anti-caste organizations, the state has been forced to legislate the manual scavenging question. But as we have seen, neither has the state taken steps to identify the manual scavengers, and even the ones that are identified, the state displays unwillingness to rehabilitate them. Lastly, even the white and non-Dalit civil society is yet to have an agreement to end such practices.
Thank you, Sumit, for constituting this workshop and then inviting me to speak here. I'm not sure, I think we're talking about identity and work, and I think coming to a work kind of conference on labor, I do feel slight kind of identity crisis, because I did not, when I started my project, which I will speak about briefly, I didn't think in terms of kind of a labor kind of project, but I think I'm still going to talk about that. So what I'm doing today is, my broader research interests are question of social inequality, and question of social inequality understood both as symbolic inequalities and material inequalities. And I think social inequality could be understood through the idiom of structural violence, I think the sexualization of power, so though I'm not choosing one or other analytic to understand this thing, but I would just see that how, what kind of empirical context help us or help me make sense of this thing. And this is part of my PhD research, and for which I think I explored this question of social inequality, and I wanted to explore it in a kind of a rural context. And so I identified a place which it's Sartapur, it's a pseudonym for this urbanizing village. I identified it as a kind of rural context, and when I was doing fieldwork, it became, in the government class, it became urban. So I'm just taking it as kind of an urbanizing context. And also when we talk about social inequality in India, though I think there are lots of conceptualized, when we talk about social inequality, I think for me, I think speaking from that empirical context, it becomes a question of caste. So I think that's where I'm just coming from. And in terms of methodology, yes, I wrote research proposals, all this thing, but the method in itself was being in the field. So I think just understanding what things mean, what question of social inequality, power, structural violence means, I think from being in the field. So when I observed, and I'm just going to give a brief overview of I think the kind of what I'm trying to do, and then just focus on one particular aspect of it. So when I went to explore the question of social inequality in a kind of a rural context, and I did that in along one of the villages along Delhi-Mumbai industrial corridor, Sartapur, and Sartapur is industrializing. Okay, so in this industrialization context, what happened was that the bazaar or the retail market of the village became very important, because all the migrant worker, that became a retail space for them. Lots of people came, so I think the bazaar space became very important. So what I studied there, it inductively came, was that the butcher occupation practiced by practiced by the Dalit caste critique. And so butcher occupation, what happened to that kind of occupation? So that would be the focus of that's the focus of my work. That often industrialization, and I think this is also important in the sense that when we talk about labor, is labor a marked category or unmarked category? So I think when we just speak from the empirical experience and the empirical particular positionality, we just see I think we need to I at least question that can labor can be understood just as purely unmarked category. For instance, the worker participation rate, I did see the census data from 2011 and 2001 and 2011 that how worker participation rate increased, but that kind of data did not tell me what was happening. So basically I focus on, so I think my work is on just studying what stigmatized occupations are and how do they work and how does stigma get attached to this thing. So I'm not saying that I'm speaking from the position of labor, I'm speaking from a position of work and the experiences of work. So in those spatial struggles, what happened in the bazaar, the butcher starts to make claims on the bazaar, that they want to have their shop in the bazaar. Okay, but because this is a stigmatized occupation, it starts very intricate spatial struggles in the market, and they're always they undergo a number of displacements. Okay, so the only way I think they can be included in the bazaar is through this experience of different displacements. So that's where. So in other way, when we talk about labor market, or if I just take this bazaar as a kind of market, so I think, or as a spatial entity, this space is not a physical space. This space is also a marked space, and I think what kind of marking does it go? I think that's what it becomes important. So this is briefly, I think, the Mumbai industrial corridor. So Sartapur is located between Delhi and Jaipur along the corridor. Yeah, and this is the industrial zone. So under the influence of this industrial zone, that it is industrializing. This is Sartapur, and population of around 11,000, 30 caste groups, and this is folk demography with 4 Dalit castes. About 30% of the village population is there, and their local critique of industrialization and urbanization, and so this is something that is a Sartapur Bazaar, rapid from, I think I'm just talking about the time period between 1995 to 2011 when I did field work there. So I think, so this is how the bazaar, this is a kind of a simplistic sketch of the thing, and the red dots are there on the are the meat market or the meat butcher shops. The one on the three dots on the left are their conventional neighborhood, which are Dalit neighborhoods, so they are okay to be there. But the right side is where the bazaar, the retail, the space becomes very important. So I think and that's where they're always outside the bazaar. And this is the meat market during daytime, during nighttime, during a busy winter day. And this is, as I was saying, they go through numerous spatial displacement as the bazaar expands. So this is 2002 Google image of that. It's just on the main road. So the main road is where the bazaar is. And then in 2010 it moves further back. I'm not sure that red arrow is that it's not a solid arrow, but it's still there. And then 2011 is there. And over a period of I think from 1995 to 2014 it has seen a multiple one. So what I'm going to talk about now is I think just seeing that how do we understand labor I'm just seeing it as a work, and the way I'm just trying to understand it work is that labor, when it's culturally contextualized and culturally contextualized and historically shaped, that's where it becomes work. So it's more of a social life of the work. So I think I'm just always reading labor in a particular kind of cultural context. So when I talked about butcher work and how does it, what kind of relations reduce it to make it as a kind of a stigmatized labor or stigmatized work. So the butcher work, when we talk about, is very strongly shaped by relations of disgust and relations of hatred and relations of violence. So I'm just going to talk, and I think in the previous presentation also, it was very difficult to translate this. I mean, the Hindu Rajasthani words are ghin and su, which I simplistically translating as disgust. And I'm not that much for meanings. I think that attempt here is to understand them not from definitions but from practices and experiences. Because definition tends to reduce the complexity of the meaning, and our ethnographic project is to highlight all those kind of meaning. So though I'm just using those simple translations, but it's kind of a complex one. So the butcher work is mediated through the relation of disgust and hatred. And when I talk to my butcher interlocutors, and I think whenever they talk about their work, and especially the way they explain the spatial the displacement which they have experienced in their work life, it is always that invariably they talk about disgust, okay? And disgust is not talked about at the individual level, so it's not just applies disgust and hatred is not just applied to the individual butchers who are occupied, it's a community thing as well. For instance, even the women who are not necessarily engaged in this occupation, or there are about, for instance, there are 50 households of this particular caste, only about, let's say, 8 or 9 households are involved in that, but it's a community attribute. So disgust is not only the practice of this thing, so it becomes a community attribute. And also when we talk about disgust, when I interviewed my interlocutors, and there's what they say is that everybody does the disgust, everybody have a feeling of disgust towards us, but they also very particularly say about the Brahman Banya, okay, which is translated as a particular caste located in Brahman and Banya. They don't talk about the second, if we go by the Varna order, Kshatriyas are not talked about that. So they particularly talk about both the Brahmin and the Banya have very strong vegetarian values. I'm just talking about the Sartakodin context. And their whole critique of industrialization modernity is also expressed through the relations of increase in non-vegetarianism because of the coming of the migrant. So I think this Brahman Banya is a particular kind of location which they come from. Also, you know, there are lots of studies about documenting the experience of I think discrimination, and especially when a Dalit being is constituted as a polluting being, then how do they can talk about how it's not generally easy to talk about them being polluting, okay? A Dalit being polluting, just it is a social fact in the sense that the dominant community treats them like that, and it has very important social implication, but they don't consider themselves as polluting. But in this case, what happened, they do talk about that people feel disgusted towards us, but they also say it with invoking that everybody eats meat. So that's why they will invoke even the Brahmins and the upper castes are eating meat, but they're eating it in hiding. So it's basically what this attempt, and this is my interlocutor Badami, she she talks about it, that these are hypocrites, they all are eating, and they just say that I think they feel towards disgust and hatred towards us only. So there's a universality of the substance, because everybody's being is constituted through meat eating, but only certain group become an object of disgust and this thing. So that's why it's not about the substance, it's about the substance, how it's situated in the social power relation. So that's one. The two particular ways in which I'm just saying that labor becomes culturally marked, and one of the idiom is the work as pap. So I think the butcher work is understood in the idiom of pap. Again, it's very difficult to translate pap into language, but an easy translation would be sin. So how is work sin? Because I think sin or immorality. Especially when we talk, lots of my interlocutors talked about the Bahman Bandiya, the particular caste location, as being kind of a source of the disgust, them being constituted as disgusting over this one. So I interviewed some of the people, my interlocutor, occupying the Brahmin position in the local hierarchy, and so my question was about critiques and non-vegetarianism coming of the migrant. And there's one particular Brahmin who is also occupationally priest and who serves a Khatik family. So it's not that they're not serving the Khatik family, they'll just they'll do the ritual, take whatever the gifts and all this thing, and they will not eat anything there. But yeah, so I think just documenting them, all my questions in that, asking my question led to a kind of a religious moral discourse about this occupation. So I'm just saying that kind of discourse constituted both the commodity meat as well as the identity butcher in that sense. And then the particular kind of thing which comes up, the ideology of karma. Okay, ideology of karma it's very strongly constituted by that. Then also meat as a food of demons. Okay, like Rakshaso ka khana hai. Yeah, there's superiority of moral deeds. Again, it's related to the ideology of karma, and that's, I think the thing is that I think they are prayer-worthy moral deeds. And when you have some prayer-worthy moral deeds, it's structurally constitute what is not moral worthy, and that's where it becomes the butcher identity there. And also explicitly they will talk about pollution of being, the butcher being, and pollution of the work. They, however, they do not talk about that as an individual butcher. They will talk either as a work or as a community level. Also, there's a discourse about purity and pollution have lost legitimacy in public sphere. So it depends. I think that my interlocutor is telling me this thing, not identifying particular butcher, but as a community, as a work. So it makes us think about how do we constitute public sphere. I think that's what I think one of these things. Also, there are particular etiologies which are drawn, which gets linked to butcher identity and meat eating, and which is that, for instance, in 2013 or around that time, there were severe floods in North India, in the mountains there for various pilgrim sites there. Okay. And there were lots of people who were traveling from the Sarkapur itself and Rajasthan, and the state government has organized how to get them back because they were stuck there. How does that natural calamity get explained in the village? Is that the etiology would be about the increase in the meat shops, increase in the non-vegetarianism. So all this discourse, also sexual violence, is a function of if you eat meat or not. Okay, and the road accident, because it's along the highway, so even the road accidents are explained in terms of that. So these different etiologies comes into being, and that's butcher subjectivity is constituted through these etiologies of natural calamity and other things. The second thing, so the second thing is that this is about how a work, the stigma, and if you want to commit violence against someone, you construct the being of that someone as violent, and then you can commit violence on that being. Because your violence then become as a kind of a reaction to that violence. So how does a butcher's identity in subjective is constituted as violence? So I'll just give you an example. When I was talking to two interlocutors in my field, and I told them that I'm working on industrialization and culture in Rajasthan. And so in the middle of that, I asked that who are Khatiks? Khatik is the particular caste group, and they are goat butchers. Okay, so I ask them who are critics. The person does not answer me and does. I mean, I cannot perform how he did, but he does this kind of thing. Okay, and he doesn't answer me. Then I said, I could not. I just made an expression. I don't understand what it is. Then he does it again, and they say, "वो बकरा काट हैं." They cut goats or they slaughter goats. So I think this is very important, and this is just I'm just taking this as an example. There are multiple examples of that. People will do that in their hands sometime as an act of cutting. This is more too important. I think two point is important. This act. First, when the person does this cutting act, you know, the act of slaughtering constitutes the identity of the Khatiks. You know, as I said that many women do not work; they are agricultural worker. All these things. The whole identity of the community is constituted through the act of slaughtering as the basis of community identity. There are lexical differences about this thing. When the dominant community would talk about this work, the idiom would be in terms of cutting, and cutting in particular connotations and denotation of violence. Okay. When the butchers talk about their work, they will talk in terms of, for instance, the lexical thing to make, to prepare, to prepare a goat to start selling. So they'll have a kind of slightly, I think they're different to prepare, to make, all this thing. When you ask a dominant caste group what work do Khatiks do, they do slaughtering or they cut goats. Okay. When you ask them, I think they would say we have a shop of meat. We have a dukaan, meat ki dukaan hai. So I think these lexical differences constitute the identity and attributes a particular notion of violence to the work, violence to the worker. Okay. The other point of this thing is that when the person does it on himself, I think it's very important that the person erase the animal-human distinction, okay? Because he's cutting the act on himself. That also does this thing, okay? So on the dominant community, on the would try to erase this animal-human distinction as if slaughtering an animal is equivalent to potentially slaughtering a human. That's how the violence of the community is constituted. On the other hand, for the butchers, maintaining this animal-human distinction is very central. Yeah, I'll just did this thing. Maintaining this animal-human distinction is very central, because once they have made it this distinction, then only they can slaughter. Okay, they need to see. Okay, they cannot. I think in certain ways the goat becomes slaughterable once the animalness of the goat has been solidified. Okay, so that's where and there are lots of other ways. The joking discourse is the other way where, for instance, this term joking discourse constitutes their identity as violent. You killed a Brahmin last time was a fact told to one of my butcher interlocutors because he helped another party member to win the local panchayat election. And the person who lost was a Brahmin. Okay, so in joking discourse, it has become that you killed a Brahmin in the last election, and to kill a Brahmin, the joke would continue. And this is between a Dalit and a Brahmin person. Okay, and the Brahmin person is politically important, so that's why he cannot exclude himself from the interacting with Dalits. So this is the context of the friendship, you know. So in that, I think there's lots of circulations goes about. So I think the butcher's identity is constituted in that way. So I think just to close, I think I'm just trying to read this in terms of the symbolic power. You know, we talk about labor in terms of the economics of it, use value, exchange value. Does meat is meat a commodity for Brahmins? Maybe not, because meat would be because there's no exchange value vis-a-vis Brahmin because they're vegetarian in that sense. But meat is a ritual commodity in that sense. So I think this is what I'm just trying to read it. I think the labor becomes work through particular kinds of symbolic processes, and I think these are some of the symbolic processes. Thank you.
And maybe we start by introducing ourselves.
So yeah, I'm working on second-hand business in Lebanon. And actually, there is a mistake in the program. I'm not already a doctor, but I'm just ending my second year of PhD.
In anticipation.
So your name?
Yeah. I'm Emmanuel.
Yeah. Hello, I'm Katrina. So first of all, really, like everybody already said today, but my thanks again to Sumit for organizing this, for having us here at Jindal, and for treating us so well, and also for allowing us to listen today to these really like fantastic and for me very impressive presentations this morning and this afternoon. So my name is Katrina. I'm based in Tunis at the moment, and bear with us. So today we decided, actually quite
nominally kind of research the same global economy. And we do so in two different contexts. Sorry, you can't actually read the writing, but I hope that you all know where Beirut is. So Beirut is the capital city of Lebanon. That's Emmanuel's field site. And my field site is Tunis, the capital city of Tunisia. And we both, kind of from different angles, Emmanuel is an anthropologist and myself as a geographer, actually in urban geography, started to research in these two different urban contexts the global second-hand clothes economy. So let me say something briefly about the kind of context of this economy. So the global second-hand garment economy, which today actually also increasingly includes new unsold textile stocks, especially from kind of big fast fashion labels, has today become of crucial importance to the continued functioning of really of the global fashion market. And this is so because global clothing production has doubled over the last 15 years, and at the same time the average kind of lifetime of garments has dropped to a record low, producing unprecedented amounts of textile waste worldwide that obviously produce costs and thus constitute a key challenge to the global fashion industry. And so while the global trade in used garments has today reached really unprecedented growth levels all over the world, the export and resale of leftover stocks, in fact, dates back more than a century. It began with shipments really of manufactured garments from imperial powers and countries at the time in colonial dependencies, so at the end of the beginning of 20th century, but also end of 19th century. And in both Lebanon and Tunisia, actually this trade began with shipments of military surplus materials from the Allied forces, so France, the US, Great Britain, to the countries that at the time were still in colonial dependencies. And then another surge in this economy appeared in the 1980s and 1990s with an increase in the donation of garments for charity in the West. Then also with the kind of development of really of a global industry of humanitarian aid. And both Lebanon and Tunisia assumed a really important role actually in this global trade, not only as end consumer markets, but also as redistribution points to their neighboring countries. We will hear about this more from Emmanuel right now. And in the case of Tunisia, also really to other parts of the world.
So our ethnographic research on the second-hand clothing trade in two specific urban contexts, when set side by side, demonstrates how what nominally form parts of the same global economy, in fact, becomes articulated in highly differentiated ways at the urban scale. The second-hand clothes economies in the two cities of Beirut and Tunis are not only characterized by distinct political economies and social dynamics, they also become manifest in different urban forms and produce highly divergent working lives, with particular structures and professional hierarchies, occupational denomination, and diverging everyday experiences. So, despite these differences, work in the used garment economy is subject to similar, powerful framing in both contexts. Work in the second-hand economy is thus often denied the status of labor or productive work, and is instead considered as trading activity with little added value that is largely informal. Sorry for my English. Consequently, work in the urban used good economies of Beirut and Tunis is linked to specific social groups, most notably rural migrants and refugees, and is moreover framed as inherent male activity. So in the following, we want to grapple with a particular aspect of working lives in the contemporary second-hand clothes economy in our respective research contexts, and hope to thereby raise broader questions regarding, first, how particular forms of work become framed as marginal work and are consequently denied the status of productive labor, or are excluded from the definition of labor completely. And second, the role of ethnographic research in going beyond dominant framing of work and providing that different accounts focus on diverse experiences of work and working lives in the city. So I will begin with the Lebanese context. So first of all, my ongoing PhD research in anthropology is part of a Franco-Lebanese research program entitled On the Margin of Formal Employment, a multidisciplinary survey of work in Lebanon. So this program brings together geographers, sociologists, anthropologists, economists, but also members of civil society. And this program is based on the dual observation that first, labor and work are subjects little explored scientifically speaking in Lebanon, and second, that formal employment as an economic, political and social institution is becoming a minority in Lebanon. First of all, I would like to draw your attention to the vocabulary on labor and work and difficulties of translation from Arabic to French, from French to English, or even maybe from English to Hindi. For instance, in French we only have one word to define both labor and work, that is travail. Moreover, I had so much difficulty to translate the French term salariat, that is formal employment, to English. So I think we should seriously think about it, as naming these realities is not insignificant. So I'm really happy to have this opportunity to share with you my ongoing research and my current reflection on the margins of formal employment through the example of the second-hand trade in Beirut. So I decided to briefly develop the following aspects. That is the tight and ambiguous relationship between the migrants' rights and both the right to work and labor law in Lebanon. So it's necessary to begin by pointing out that the second-hand garment in Lebanon suffers from triply negative representation that refers to your work actually. It's associated with dirt, poverty and strangeness in the national sense. Thus, it's relegated to marginal neighborhoods where migrants are relegated to live or reside, but I'm sorry, I'm forced to roughly summarize the urban context. It's not exactly the reality, but well. So here you can see a very marginal area in Tripoli. Actually, this is a city in the north of Lebanon. So unlike Tunis, second-hand garments is absolutely not widespread throughout the city of Beirut. Indeed, in Lebanon, this is a relatively modest economy, and it can be considered as a resourcefulness migratory economy, and that is my point today. Yeah, just a side note, I'm going to use the notion of migrants rather than refugees in my talk, but I refer to all the kind of forced or enforced displaced people. Few key data right now. So around a lot of Syrian workers were employed in Lebanon in the 90s due to the massive need of working force of Lebanon, weakened, even destroyed by the 15 years of civil war. Both residence and work permits were really advantageous for Syrians in Lebanon, but in 2011, with the Syrian Popular Movement, well, at this moment, 1.5 million Syrians found refuge in Lebanon. Otherwise, in Lebanon right now, 1 in 4 is a Syrian refugee. So in 2014, the residence and work permit changed in a very restrictive way. Access to work, but also to housing and education, is mainly denied for Syrian people in Lebanon today. And they are allowed to work only in the agricultural or construction sectors, and they are submitted to the kafala regime, but I don't have time to deal with it right now. So the figure of the Syrian in Lebanon passed from that of the workers to that of the refugees, and consequently, as employment became almost impossible for them, their daily activities were not anymore considered as labor but as work. And at once, second-hand business became more visible in the city. So I came to my to the crux of the matter. So that the second-hand business in Lebanon is a kind of urban migrant entrepreneurship. So that is, yeah, it appears as a coping strategy to make a living subverting the law. So the people I work with have no diplomas. For the ones who live in Lebanon for a long time, they get engaged in this business from their childhood with the support of their parents, as there are few other options actually for the future. So this is a father-to-son business, even a family business. For instance, Salim, that is a Palestinian refugee, born in a refugee camp located in the southern suburbs of Beirut, started working, right now he has 18 years old. He started working at the Sunday market with his father when he was not even 10 years old. And the father held this family business, and there are different locations in the cities to sell second-hand garments. Well, in Lebanon, being a migrant-deprived people of their right to work, thus they develop strategies on the margin to make a living based on their skills and social network. Consequently, no labor rights protect them. I got another example, but I think I will let the...
How much time do we have to develop Tunis?
6 minutes.
Oh wow, okay. Okay, that's gonna be a race. Okay, yeah.
In a competitive stance.
We're two, so we get a little bonus.
Already bonus.
A time bonus. Yeah. Okay. So let us jump to the Tunis context. We'll see that while we're nominally talking, let's say, about the same global circulation, we're actually looking at a very, very different economy here at the urban scale. And so maybe let me begin by saying that work in the second-hand clothes trade in Tunis is today similar to Lebanon, still associated with different forms of urban marginality and with poverty. And this is, of course, in both contexts, as Emmanuel has already said, linked to the kind of materiality, right, of the commodity as a not quite commodity, and as something that has historical links to donations, aid deliveries, etc. So kind of historically, it's grown as an economy on the margins. So this photo is from central Tunis, a wasteland actually on the site of the demolition site of the ancient Jewish quarter, the Hara of Tunis. And why am I showing this picture? Because from the beginning, kind of trade in second-hand clothes was marginalized also spatially, so kind of it wasn't accommodated in any kind of formal marketplaces, so it always took place on the kind of sides or the margins of marketplaces or on illegally occupied, and here we're coming back to the idea of a stigmatized occupation of urban space. This is how it was occupied. And so the second-hand clothes economy at the same time, very similar to Lebanon today, actually then provided a kind of opening for marginalized social groups that didn't have access to the kind of dominant or formal labor market in the city. And in the case of Tunisia in the 1960s and 1970s, these were thousands of new arrivals from the countryside, so rural migrants, especially from the kind of very impoverished northwest of Tunisia, so towards the Algerian border. And until today, even though the economy has really changed dramatically, this kind of figure of the stigmatized freak trader still kind of reverberates. So it is very important to acknowledge that today in Tunisia, the second-hand clothes economy is extremely important. This map is just to show how widespread different kinds of permanent and weekly markets are in green and in yellow, and as well as wholesale centers. So this is really a ubiquitous economy economy all across the city, and up to 80% of Tunisians buy today mainly from the fripe, so that's what fripe is the name for second-hand clothes, mainly from the fripe or regularly from the fripe. So we're talking about a ubiquitous economy and really kind of a mainstream consumer choice, so not at all the kind of marginalized economy that we just heard about in the case of Lebanon. And as I said, despite these dramatic growth rates, there's still this idea of jabri. Jabri is the Tunisian term to refer to someone who's rural, who's kind of a threat to the urbanity of the city because they're uneducated, they come from rural areas. And despite the fact that most of the so-called fripiers, the fripe traders that you see in these photos, are actually second or third generation migrants, so they're born in Tunis. But this figure of the jabri is still there. This is very closely linked to a kind of framing of work around masculinity. So the kind of fripier, the fripe trader as the archetypal masculine figure, so something that is really very closely entangled with the idea of physical strength that you see in these pictures, I think, the idea of constant mobility, so the idea that they're on the move between markets, and the idea of exposure, so bodily exposure and visibility in public space, something that again we have to culturally situate in Tunisia, and I would say in the wider Arab world, and an idea where trading, and especially trading in public space, is very much closely entangled with masculinity, the male body, the market as male territory, and also the idea that trading skills are really closely entangled with kind of masculine social status. So I want to actually kind of topple and unsettle, 2 minutes, I still want to topple and unsettle these kind of dominant framings of work by actually looking at a crucially important workforce that is completely kind of invisibilized by these dominant discourses of work, namely farreza. They call it farreza is an informal occupational designation that is a female designation for women workers who work in sorting. And they're about, the official number is 10,000 of these workers who work in clothes sorting, second-hand clothes sorting factories all over Tunisia. They're actually probably a lot more because there's a lot of undeclared work. And so these workers are very rarely kind of acknowledged as workers, but also, and even less so, as serious economic actors in the fripe economy. But actually a kind of closer ethnographic engagement with the sorting work that these women perform, I think really kind of questions a lot of the assumptions that come even with that label of factory work. Because what we're looking at here is the transformation of what you see in this photo, so really kind of heaps of trash, like the way these second-hand clothes are actually donated, so mixed with trash, with garbage, with plastic, and their transformation into this, so folded and neatly graded categories, product categories, but also categories of value. So the production process that we're looking at here is in many ways elusive and not very typical for a factory, right? Because there's nothing new produced. The garments are ostensibly the same as they enter and leave the factory. But what women sorters do here in their sorting is actually they perform very complex forms of valuation by kind of inserting these garments that ostensibly remain the same into new structures of value and meaning. And so I really devoted kind of months of ethnographic research to these processes because this production process is actually highly, highly complex, and a close look at these production processes shows that this cannot be really kind of framed as typical factory work because these processes cannot be mechanized, they're difficult to standardize, and these women acquire kind of gradual on-the-job knowledge that actually makes them indispensable to the productive process of the factory and makes it very costly and very difficult to replace them over time. Meaning they acquire a position of authority in the factory. Here we have a group of the most senior so-called farreza in the factory, and they really develop kind of a professional identity around this term farreza, so sorter. And I think this brings us back to the discussion of this morning, the idea that here the kind of professional identity is linked to a process of work, so the process of sorting, the skill of sorting, the knowledge, and very embodied and tacit knowledge of sorting, rather than just the factory. So actually what we see is that a lot of the women who work in the factory do not only work in the factory, but they actually use their clout, their negotiating clout, to, for example, to negotiate not only informal bonuses or primes to their wages, but also contingents of garments that they take with them, for example on a weekly basis, and transport it out of the factory to places all over the city, like the ones I just showed, so women-owned free boutiques like this one, but also kind of beauty salons, etc., and then resell these garments in diverse spaces of the city. So I know I'm completely out of time, so I want to wrap this up. 1 minute. And maybe it's also okay not to have conclusions, because I think our goal was to kind of, you know, provoke an opening and debate rather than present conclusions. But why do I want to kind of draw attention to this kind of idea of the Farese and the flip economies? I think as a geographer, obviously what fascinates me is how does this kind of unsettle our ideas, our often preconceived ideas about what is a workplace in the city, where does work actually take place, and to what extent are these workplaces contained or not? Like, do we look at the market space as a contained place, or where does the market start, where does it end? Where does the factory start and where does it end? And what does the label of the factory actually tell us about the work that takes place within the factory? Yeah.
Okay. This one which is concerned exactly with the first two presentations is the navigational crisis that certain groups have in terms of their choice architecture of work. You're doing the same work generationally over a period of time because you have a lack of choice to go into doing another task. Maybe you value it, you do it, but some do not have the choice as well. This is clearly brought out in the last presentation as well when we're looking at the labor law dispute on the concept of dignity, primarily. Which is to say, I don't think that the value of work that I am doing is creating that much of respect and value of me in the society, but at the same time I don't have a choice. I do what I'm required to do, but at the same time society is doing everything it can in the environment around me to discriminate. I feel if we can reflect a little bit on this, that would be helpful. And any other questions, anyone? So we'll take.
Ask a question.
Oh, okay. Please. Sorry. Go ahead. Proceed.
Yeah, I had a question to Bhavani. Thank you for this really fascinating presentation. And so I was interested actually in two things. So the first thing, and this might be a very ignorant remark because I don't know about India, but so I guess from the context I work in, so the Arab world, it was really interesting for me because I guess the butcher in the Tunisian context, and I know also in the Egyptian context, is a very kind of respectable profession. And even kind of in the hierarchy of trades, of food trade, is definitely kind of at the top of the hierarchy of food trade. And so I was wondering, like, are there kind of other, because you were also saying, right, this is very culturally and socially situated, like in this particular space, in this particular, so would there be kind of other figures of butchers in other spaces that are not of the same case and that, you know, would be in a completely different kind of, social status, etc. And then the second thing I wanted to kind of push a little bit because I'm really interested in this person, but I think it also really comes out in your presentation, this kind of relation between urbanization and the bazaar, and like the role of the bazaar as being kind of almost like the motor or the engine of urbanization, if understood, or the transformation of the village. If you could speak a little bit more about that.
You can just finally take Rahul and
Yeah.
come back.
Very quick. First of all, three of the presentations were very interesting because they're talking about the identity, and I could see one common intersecting line was that the identity was reinforcing in a different types of like a location in which you are dealing with. The reinforcing identity, for instance, in Ria's case, like the caste identity, and then scavengers, it's been reinforced. Like for instance, within the scavenging community, like we have a scavengers which has been employed by the government. For them, the scavenging they would like to continue, but those who are the private caste-based occupation but employed by the private regulator, they do not want to engage into that. So this is some kind of the mode of production is really enforcing this kind of identity. Even in Bhavani's presentation, that really came out very well. I have a specific question for you because that's first, like when you actually doing the data analysis with the budget provisions, did you really found out that these are actually the outcome budgets that are actually going designed considering the population in the mind, or is simply that is random? Because I could not see any And even the census cannot tell you about this kind of a data. So just wanted your opinion about how they allocated the budget from the beach ground. Second your presentation was all of your presentation was so, but were most powerful because you are linking with the community. And there I realized that these are not only the work, but you are linking work with the violence. And there I realized that anybody's work could be as violent as, and this is where it builds up the kind of my social consciousness. If the Khatik community is there for years, have they really normalized this kind of violence in their day-to-day life? How they have actually normalized this kind of, because you are saying the particular act. So it means that they have somehow negotiated with that consciousness and they have accepted, now this is my fate and I have to continue with that. So is this a kind of a trap, or they really want to have certain kind of a mobility value? And the last one, this is really interesting, but this is again, it is same kind of a problem. If you look at most of the part in the Europe, you have the flea market and they have been run by either Turkish or maybe the immigrants by kind of a thing. And this is, they have created their second level of a market. If you ask me in economics, and I think many of my economics would say, ever since the George Akerlof came up with the paper market for the lemons, in that second.
So now your question was on from where did I get these figures, or is it about how state decides
How
this
state.
much? Okay, so they don't have calculations. So per se for the SC budget, they have said that 16.5%, which is our proportion of the population, that has to be 16.5% of the union budget has to be the SC budget, which has never been a case. They reach around 14, 13, but they do not allocate 16.5% from the union budget under the SC budget. Particularly for the schemes like managed scavenging, so they don't have a calculation per se that this much of money will do this much of work for these many people. These are announcements basically. So they announce that, okay, this is our prime scheme this time and we're giving 110 crores to managed scavengers, but they don't have a specific calculation. So like I described, that if we divide that 110 crores by the number of total scavengers, then we get that only 2,500 scavengers can be rehabilitated from that amount. So this happens because they do not have a clear calculation of that how much money would go or how much money could help how many people. So they don't have it. These are announcements. And can you restate your question?
I think
So you were asking for an
Thanks a lot. I think these are very good questions, and let me just see if I can do justice to the discussion. So Dipanshu's question about, first question was the externality, social cultural externality and labor. I think that's where I think this also relates to the question about labor and work. I think my effort and also my way of understanding is not to make that distinction between material and symbolic. I think I'm just saying it is essential to you. I would just say that externality, yes, but also I think it's coming from that essentially. I think that's why the labor, I think the symbolic as well as the material are co-constituting each other. So in that sense, I'm just saying that externality is the essential in some ways. Okay, that's where if you want to understand labor and stigmatize labor, and that's not just only economic labor, but when we talk about butcher labor, it's not just the commodity as meat. You need to do emotional labor to precisely come out that the violence you can handle, the notions of the violence. So if you need to do the commodity calculation, the use value, exchange value calculation, generally we don't do that affective and emotional labor which goes into the making of the commodity. So in that sense, for me, I think this particular kind of thing would be essential category. Each worker, I think we just talk about labor, worker, but worker is also an identity. Here it's a stigmatized identity, many are positive identities in that sense. I think that's the first question about the externality one. Stratification by dispossession. I think I really liked your framing of it, but also I think precisely, but maybe it's coming from my framework, which is Bourdieu kind of thing, which I want to analyze, who talks about structured structure and structuring structures. What does it mean is that, and it's also the gender studies kind of, they are not gender roles, but they are gender subjectivities which are continuously performatively constituted through the everyday performance. So here you can just say, very well say, stratification by dispossession, yeah. But one can also say dispossession by stratification. So in that sense, dispossession leads to stratification. That's how caste relations reproduce themselves. So it's a dynamic kind of thing. In my particular case, what contributes to this dynamic? For instance, the joking discourse. Now, because the caste-based insult, all these things are not publicly, you could be legal, it's a criminal act. That's why the joking discourse comes, okay, which is shaping that identity. When you invoking natural calamity in Himalayas to your local butchers and the meat-eating practices, these are the everyday continuous processes, okay? Yes, stratification by dispossession and dispossession by stratification. So I will just see it's a continuous kind of thing, but I mean, so in that would be there. Okay, butcher as an occupation, and I think this is also related to the violence thing. I don't know what is violence, you know. For instance, if the same act is done by a Rajput, which is a second by the Varna hierarchy, I think there are different meaning. I think the meaning, and this is also I think broader meaning, and you said this about I think how work and travail and work and labor does not constitute. I think there's so much complexity, and I'm not a big person, and we use definition. Those definitions does not hide more than what they tell. Okay, so in that sense, I think so. So I'm just saying that it's the social power relations which gives the meaning to the thing. So the violence becomes violence because when you read it with reference to particular social location. If the butcher social location, yes, it's violent. If it's another social location, for instance, a warrior social location, then it will be warrior aesthetics, warrior all of these things. So the same act would be read in that sense. Okay, so I think that's where I think it becomes clear. And I think to Katrina's answer, butcher as an occupation as respect over the stigma, then I think it's a social cultural social power shape this thing. Also, I think work environment in the definition. Maybe I think I missed some point about. Yeah, I mean maybe I can just come back on that.
Let's have Emmanuel and Catherine, please.
The question about the value in the supply chain, because it's going to take an hour, so we can discuss about that later. It's going to take too long. And I think to come back to maybe Arnaud's question, thank you for pointing that out. I think that's totally right, and I think actually Bhavani just almost answered your question. Of course, there's a tension, and of course, stigmatized work, right, and stigmatized identities of work can also at the same time be very affirmative identities of work. So very often there is a tension here, and there's definitely a tension in this case. So the kind of term of the jabri as the kind of rural person, as a threat, etc., is selectively used and very often to perpetrate violence. So for example, right before a clearance campaign against a market, it would be kind of selectively manipulated, used, etc., right? And also, and I think it's very closely entangled with the idea of a negative kind of idea of the male body, or the kind of, you know, rural male body as threat. So for example, feelings of unsafety, etc., that are used by kind of middle classes, for example, to lobby or push for these kind of campaigns and this kind of perpetration of violence. At the same time, you cannot deny that it's also an affirmative kind of male and very kind of masculine form of kind of affirmative identity of work, of the fripier, that is expressed through music, through a particular style, through this kind of life on the road, on the trucks, like a particular forms of kind of male sociability that in of as themselves are then again very exclusive to women, for example, who try to make a life or construct an occupation in the sector. So I think, thank you for pointing that out. I think that's exactly the kind of tension that I'm interested in. Very quickly, maybe to come back to this question around like framings and perceptions of work and how these, you know, sometimes go alongside each other. I think I just very quickly want to point out that very often they also don't, right? So very often I think understanding the way work is framed is not kind of sufficient to understand what the kind of complex self-perceptions of work are. And I think that relates to the question around value, kind of where is value produced, who produces value, who has access to value. And once again, I think that the kind of assessment of, you know, who produces value and what, you know, what are the kind of marginal, what are the gains that are made is insufficient to qualify work as marginal. Because I think in that sense, of course, like we're looking at marginalized factory labor, but I think what we need to look at is also what are the different kind of forms and registers of value that are being produced. And I think then that question becomes a lot more complicated, right, about this framing. Yeah, and maybe one last thing, I think it was a question that came from here, around, or from you, sorry, around this kind of question of like official recognition, what do you do with this question of recognition. So I'm actually speaking here about an economy that can in no way be called an informal economy. I'm talking about an economy that has a very complex political economy that is highly regulated. And that, I mean, again, right, forms of regulation are producing the forms of what we could then consider kind of informality or precariousness. So it's rather kind of a product of regulation and of selective recognition by the state that has produced this, rather than, I think, what you were describing, kind of a kind of autonomous sphere that is kind of unregulated and autonomously functioning. I think that would be really the wrong way of describing the economy that I'm looking at. Thank you.
Okay, just quickly, the Arabic word for the word.
So the word that you looked up is amal. Amal. Amel is the worker and amal is work. But this is Fusha, this is classical Arabic. So now we work in two contexts with two different Arabic dialects are spoken. So here it would be shoghl, right? Shoghl. And in Tunisia it would be khidma. And actually khidma means service in classical Arabic and is a very stigmatized term. And in Tunisian Arabic it means work and is not a stigmatized term. So we're entering like a very, very difficult
The
terrain.
reason why I asked is I was navigating through this Tel Aviv's market, Shubha Karmel market, which is one of the oldest market. Mostly it was habited by different kinds of Arabic traders of different. So I was asking them about labor, work, how are you putting it? Everyone is using a different word.
Yes.